Inspirational Creatives, episode 275. Welcome to Inspirational Creatives. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence. Join me every Friday as I chat with successful artists, producers, and creative entrepreneurs who share powerful stories and strategies. They can help you to create the life that you want. Listen each week as these inspirational creatives show you how to take your creativity to the next level. You'll learn how to create a sustainable business that inspires others and gives you the financial freedom and lifestyle that you want. Thanks for listening. Make sure you sign up at inspirationalcreatives.com to get free exclusive bonus material. And now, on with the show. Rob here, and a warm welcome to a very special episode of Inspirational Creatives. Today I have the privilege of interviewing not only the first of a number of special guests based in my local area, Norwich, England, but someone who is responsible for creating professional artists across the country and around the globe today. He is someone who has been appointed an OBE for his services to education in the 2017 Queen's Birthday Honours List. This is the first interview as part of a short series I've chosen to create as part of the Inspirational Creatives podcast to celebrate some of the incredible inspirational creatives that are right here on my doorstep. I've chosen to call this short sub-series Bringing It Home, as I decide the future of this podcast as it closes in on its 5th birthday and almost 300 episodes. It dawned on me earlier this year at various festivals, meetups and events that there are inspirational people with fascinating stories, strategies and ideas everywhere. And the live interview I'm about to share with you is no exception. My guest today has been at the Norwich University of the Arts since 2009 and has worked in specialist arts higher education for over 25 years. Having studied at the University of Sussex today, he is the Vice-Chancellor at the NUA, as well as the Chair for the new Anglia LEP Digital Creatives Group, as well as being on the board of a number of school trusts. I had the pleasure of chatting with him earlier this week at the Future Radio Studios in the heart of Norwich, literally in the shadow of the medieval Norwich Castle. So from Bank Plain in Norwich, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Professor John Last. Professor John Last, lovely to have you here in Future Radio Studios in the heart of Norwich. Very much thank you for your time today.
Not at all. It's a delight to be here, Rob.
Thank you. Just for our listener who may not know you, how would you describe yourself and what it is you do in the world today?
Well, I'm very lucky to be the Vice-Chancellor of Norwich University of the Arts. The university is a specialist arts university. We've got 2,500 students, and they're all very creative and all very talented. And it's my great privilege to lead a team that runs the university.
And what's involved in leading that team on a day-to-day basis?
Well, a lot of it is just making sure that we're planning for the future. So my job is probably more forward-looking than the job that my colleagues do with the students. So we're looking at what the university will be in 10 and 20 years' time. We're future thinking about new disciplines and new subjects. We're watching the way that students' skills are changing. We're watching what's happening in schools. But principally, the vast majority of the university is focused day to day on getting the most out of these very creative students who produce the most astonishing work.
Incredible. So many questions to ask you around all of that. In terms of the future, could you give us a little bit of a glimpse of the sort of things that you're grappling with at the moment?
Well, I suppose I'm very interested in how VR and changing augmented reality and things like that will affect, well, our daily lives, really. But what will that do to the disciplines? And how will the new technologies affect the sort of skills that students have, the sort of skills that students need? Also, I think there's a lot of discussion at the moment about the relative worth and merit of arts degrees and science degrees. And I take the view that they're both equally valuable. But I have noted a lot of research coming out of things like the World Bank and UNESCO, talking about creativity being a core skill for everybody. And I can understand why they say that, because obviously as we get more technology working on our lives and our working lives, then a lot of stuff that it used to be done by people will be done automatically and digitally. And that will lead people to have different sorts of skills. We're having high-level skills, and the skills of creativity will be vital for the next generation, absolutely vital.
So are you suggesting there's a greater emphasis on creativity and creative skills for the future?
I think it's undoubtedly going to be the case. There's no doubt that as automation takes over a lot of jobs, then how people respond and what the working environment will be is going to be about creativity. And it's going to be about how those people who think differently can make a difference for all of us.
I think you're touching upon it just there, but what does creativity mean to you, John?
It's quite a complicated concept, of course, but I suppose what I'm looking for is people who think differently, people who look sideways, people who will try things out, people who are actually, in our case, educated through what we do at the university to think differently, to have a conceptual way of addressing problems that will allow them to come up with different sorts of ideas.
One of the things that's fascinated me researching this for my own series and interests is the number of experts that I speak to that work in a creative discipline, and they use that word discipline. It's amazing how rigid they are in terms of the work that they do and the boundaries that they set for themselves. From your point of view, what's the importance of that, being a creative person in a structured form?
Well, I think we do all have to work within constraints and structures. In some ways or others. And a lot of my students, for example, if you take their current circumstance, will be given a brief when they leave their university. They get a job, they work freelance or in a studio or whatever. And someone will say, well, we'd like this doing, we'd like it done by this time and within this sort of budget. So there are always sort of frames in which people are operating, with possible exception of a few fine artists. But in general, we need frames and structures. But within, so we need to make sure our students are conscious of those ways of working, but within those ways of working, they are producing the most incredibly creative, the most original and different work, but in the context of understanding that employability and the skills that we all need to survive day to day. You're not exempt if you're a creative, but you approach them somewhat differently sometimes.
Do you feel that creativity benefits from constraints in that sense?
About benefits, I think creativity sort of always bubbles up out of people who are creative, but sometimes actually having frameworks in which to operate are helpful for all of us. An interview can take so long, and that focuses our minds on our answers and our questions. That's probably a simple analogy, but it probably works for creativity too.
I'd love to learn a little bit more about you as a person. How did you end up in Norfolk?
Oh, well, it's a series of happy accidents, really. I was born in Cambridgeshire, so not that far away. So I've always been very sort of drawn to these rather bleak but rather beautiful flat landscapes of our region. But I went away to study in Brighton and then in Leeds, and then I worked in London and Brighton and then down in Dorset. But a job came up. It was as simple as that. And I was very attracted to what was a wonderful art school at Norwich, which was evolving into a very interesting creative university. And I was very lucky enough to be asked to come and do that job.
And when was that, and how did that experience unfold?
Well, I was appointed in 2008, so I've been here now 12 years, I suppose, that sort of period of time. And it was just a chance to work from another creative university that had been on a similar journey down in Bournemouth. And it struck me that the potential here, I mean, it's a wonderful city. It's a very creative city. It's got a fantastic art scene. It's got music and it's got creativity as part of its DNA. But it's got a very human scale, and I like that. And I think it's one of the things that I particularly like is the way that the city embraces the university and its students. They're very welcoming as a city. And I think the students respond to that by feeling very much part of it. It's an integrated city in that sense, and I rather like that.
And what about your background in terms of creativity and the arts and design?
Well, it's an interesting one, I suppose, because I'm probably one of the few people at university who don't make things in the same way that everybody else does. I started off with English and philosophy as undergraduate degrees, and then did a postgraduate in film studies and film theory, and then ended up doing just teaching in London. And I ended up, through a sort of series of accidents really, running the Croydon School of Art. And from Croydon School of Art, I went down to Bournemouth, and from Bournemouth to Norwich. But I think what defines the university is that everybody makes things. They're all very creative. And I suppose my own creativity is expressed in a different way. And I hope that it's creative leadership.
There's something just you said there triggered something when I was researching prior to this interview. There's a gap between your undergraduate studies and your master's in the 70s and 80s. How did you fill that gap, and what was the story there?
Well, I worked for a charity for a year. I worked for Help the Aged. I suppose appropriately, young people are always interested in social issues, and I was very concerned about what I saw as a sort of very neglected and not very sort of easily explained to young people problem that the elderly were having in terms of sort of housing and poverty and a whole series of issues. And I sort of wanted really to make the issue of the elderly more known, and certainly for young people to know about it. So I worked for a charity for a year. But I always felt I was going to end up in some sort of teaching academic role. Somehow, it's without ever articulating it, I think it was always somewhere in the back of my mind that was what I was going to be doing in some way or shape or form.
That experience that you had there, what did that teach you? What did you learn from that?
I think I learned that although I didn't really know how to do it in a professional sense, I really like talking and working with young people. I spent a very privileged year going to dozens of schools in London and the Southeast, just talking to young people. And often it was the sort of perhaps the less academic, those students who weren't doing a lot of A-level or GCSE work. And so I had the chance to talk with them. And I thought how interesting it was to try and find things that connected in their experience with things I was wanting them to think about. And when you get that right, as I think my colleagues do in their work with the undergraduates, it's the most incredibly rewarding experience you can have, because you see people start to think and start to change, and they articulate new concepts and new ideas with you. And that's a very, very special thing when it works. Doesn't always work, of course. I don't claim that. But
what do you think it is that clicks when that does happen positively?
I suppose you make a connection between the lived experience of people and the ideas and the concepts you want them to incorporate into that lived experience. So it's making connections, really. And also I think it's encouraging things that may be within them that they haven't necessarily known how to articulate, or whether it was okay to say it. So you're encouraging them to articulate ideas and to share thoughts with them in a safe space, in a way that they know they can say something and they won't be necessarily judged harshly for it. I mean, often with the elderly, people have quite negative sort of things, and you have to let them say those things before you can talk about the things that are positive. And it's often the case with creativity. You will have ideas that may or may not be fully formed, but you shouldn't judge them harshly until you let the whole process come out and be fully explored.
What is it about the arts and creativity in your mind that's really important?
I mean, we make things. As societies, we make things, and we value those things that are made, be it the furniture we're sitting on, be it the paintings around us, be it the films we watch. And all those are creative activities, and they involve teams. And I think that we as societies have always wanted to share our creativity with each other in various ways and shapes. And I think that sharing is important, because it shares ideas. It gives us ideas and values which can be hugely important, particularly at times of stress and difficulty. And so I think the arts are in a sort of old-fashioned sense, civilizing, but also they challenge and they help form new ideas. And certainly with the case of the university students, they offer new ideas. They are the calling card of the next generation. This is what we think. These are our concerns. And so if we look at just last year's graduation show, because this year's show is going up as we're talking, what was fascinating and incredibly reassuring and positive to me was the concern our students had for the environment, for recycling, for issues which are really important in our society. And these are the young generation who will have to work and solve it with the current generations. And they were concerned about plastics. They were concerned about waste in fashion. They were concerned about consumer sort of throwaway societies. These are important issues. And it came out in student work. And you see a generation starting to say what they want to do with the world. That's hugely important. And it's a great privilege.
Just to get a sense of that gravity, in the last 12 years of your experience working at the NUA, how has that changed? The graduation events back then, 10 years ago or so, how does today compare with them?
Oh, well, each generation will pick up on issues and ideas that would have helped shape them and help make them, at that point in their life and thinking, see these as the most important things they want to express. So I suppose those concerns have raged. There was concerns around sort of animal testing and animal sort of well-being at one stage. Each generation will pick up a thing. So I don't think it's changed. I just think that we've become bigger as a university. We've doubled in size since 2009, and we've got new subjects. The other big change, of course, is the subject mix has altered, because sitting here in this highly digital studio, it's a reminder that most of our disciplines that are growing now are in digital sphere. So we've introduced degrees in games development, games art, VFX. So I suppose there's a change in the media that people are using. If you'd asked me that question and you'd asked me to go back, say, 50 years, we'd be looking at a university that was principally fine art and graphic design. But now it's a much more interesting and richer mix, including fine art and graphic design, but now including architecture and media. And so all those new disciplines bring other things. They make it a richer community, and it makes the ideas just a bit more interesting.
That's fascinating. The way you're expressing that, I'm getting a sense that nothing's really being lost here when you're describing it as a richer community. Is there still very much an element of the hands-on disciplines, the craft type work?
Everybody is making things, and whether you're making it on a screen or whether you're making it in 3D, it's actually still about making, and it's still about creating. So I think that we mustn't be too nostalgic for old technologies. I mean, they have their place, and sometimes they'll come back into fashion. But if you take photography, there's still an interest in sort of what one might call very traditional old-fashioned photographic making. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But the whole way that we make images now has been revolutionised by digital technology. And it's probably incumbent on us as a university to acknowledge the history, but to make sure our students leave with an absolutely clear sense about what is happening in photography and what the technology will make it possible to do. And going back to that things about sort of, virtual reality, I mean, that's going to impact on photography in quite an interesting way. I'm not quite sure what it will be yet, but it's certainly not going to be unaffected by it. So I think we're just trying to make sure that as technologies change, students can incorporate them into their thinking.
Sounds very much like you're at the leading edge in terms of the technologies and the disciplines there, which is to be expected perhaps. And obviously, new students coming in will bring in their talents, ideas and skills and abilities. What other ways are you remaining on the cutting edge of technology today?
I think for a specialist university in particular, you have to be very close to the industries that your students graduate and go into. And so we pride ourselves on being very well connected to the creative industries, not just in Norfolk, and indeed not just in London, but across the globe. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that I suppose we're just sort of future watching in a sense, but we future watch with professional experts from the industry who give very generously their time to say to us what they think is going on in the future. They come and share their knowledge with our students as lecturing community, but they also help us shape our degrees. So they're always part of a degree forming process. We have professionals from industry, and so that's always thinking about the future. And of course, you don't always want to say, well, this is happening in industry, it's perfect. But you have to say, this is happening in industry, what do we think about it? And that discussion is what the university is for, where that link between the individual creativity of the students, the wider sort of university project, which is to help them realise their potential. And then if they wish to go into industry, to know that what the industry is doing at the same time.
So what's the reality been like for you on your journey so far in terms of some of the biggest challenges that you've had to solve to get you to where you are today?
Well, I mean, it's always about having a good team around you. And I've been very lucky to have a very good team at the university. So the challenges have just been the challenges that you might expect of any sort of academic community. It's about how we create dialogues about the direction forward, what our strategy is, what our plan is, and then how you navigate the political circumstances where governments do, over the years, change their minds about things, and you have to sort of navigate what their views are on the funding of universities, for example, which have changed a lot since I've been working in university.
Yeah, sure. Particular instances that come to mind in terms of accomplishments you've been proud of, a challenge that perhaps to some unsurmountable, but you were able to overcome it and move forward.
The big problem is deciding, well, if we're going to introduce a new degree, which should it be, and how will it fit in with the university's sort of culture and mission and feel and ethos? So we've introduced degrees, and that's always an interesting question for us. It's not an insurmountable problem, because clearly we could introduce any creative subject that we thought was valuable, but it's which one you introduce and why. So we took a long time to decide what to introduce. So we chose fashion, for example, which we felt was missing from our palette of creative subjects. I think we've been very pleased with the way that's worked. I mean, one of our students won the BBC Children in Need T-shirt design competition this year, which is fantastic. And we're really proud of what our students do in fashion. But similarly, we did architecture more recently, and that's starting to evolve. And having architecture and interior design in the community just changes the type of conversations we can have. And I think that's just helped every student to have a different sort of perspective. For that reason, we're thinking about introducing the acting degree into the university in a year's time, because we also think that will bring another perspective, which will be useful. They'll bump up and they'll challenge in a particularly different way. But I think we think exciting. So they're not problems. I suppose the problem is making sure that we choose the right course, and then we choose the right staff. But they're not problems in that sense.
A really interesting point you made there. I'd love to know a little bit more about what the opportunities are within the university in terms of cross-pollination between the disciplines. How do you see that happening?
Well, it's an interesting question, that, and it's one that is something I think we're probably always grappling with. In one sense, you want students to be specialist. If you come to specialist university and you say, you're going to go away with a BA in fine art, well, what that really means is that you've spent 3 years doing fine art. And I think personally that I'm not a great fan of courses where you can do a little module here and a little module there, because I think that tends to generalism and not specialism. And I think that's not always doing students the best service, because they need to be very skilled in order to enter into whatever area of work they want to do. Having said that, as this studio demonstrates, most creative processes are collective endeavours in one sense. You work in teams. Take filmmaking as a fairly obvious example. So we also want students to understand how they work in teams, how the creative process now in particular probably moves across boundaries, how animators will work with graphic designers, how filmmakers work with VFX people. So we also think, well, we don't want you to sort of spread your specialism too far across. But on the other hand, we want you to be really aware of how you work with other disciplines. And so in our curriculum, we have a structured component in the second year when all the courses can mix around and they can all find other disciplines and other ways to work. So that's what we do at a structured level. But actually, students are much more interested in that anyway, and they find each other. So you'll find a fashion student will find a photographer, or you'll find an animator with a graphic design student because they want to do something about web design. And they sort of find their own path through that because they come to realise there's a problem they want to solve and they need a different set of skills. So partly we try and structure it, but unsurprisingly, the students, aided by their staff, also come to creative solutions. They find each other.
Yeah, and that must be quite magic when you see that happen.
It's one of the things that makes the job really exciting and great fun. And when you come to see the end of year shows, you look at the work and you think, that's fantastic, because that collaboration couldn't have happened without us having this range of disciplines, which is why this question about the discipline mix is so important to me, getting the right disciplines to help every student. So you don't just introduce a degree and think, well, that's just for them. As you introduce a new degree, you change the culture of a whole university and everybody gets a bit of a different experience, which I think is really one of the most exciting things we do.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. I think something, in my personal opinion, that's not emphasised enough is the people that you meet when you go to study at a university. What's been your own personal experience in terms of the people you still know today and your own educational background?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it is one of those sort of unspoken things that you make your friends and your lifelong contacts at university. Of course, you make other friends as you go through life, particularly through work. But I think some of those early friendships, some of those people who share your own evolution as a thinker, an artist, and as a maker, become very important to you. But in general, I think part of a university experience is the experience of the community of the university. That's why I personally prefer working in relatively small universities to the very, very large university. I think the experience you can get in a creative community is really very special. And so whilst we are continuing to grow, we're never going to want to be a massive university because you lose that opportunity to cross-pollinate, and you do get something very special out of the people you're with at university. And for many people, they'll be lifelong friends. Partners, they'll live together forever in some cases. It's quite remarkable.
You work with lots of young and aspirational creative people. Why do you believe, in your experience, because you must have a tremendous amount of visibility in terms of the student's journey, not just during the university, but beyond. When you see people getting stuck, creative people getting stuck, trying to launch their ideas into, quotes, the real world, the professional world, I think we're talking about there, where do you see them getting stuck? What suggestions or ideas would you offer to them to get their wheels spinning again?
Well, I'm not sure, Rob, that the question is entirely fair. I think everybody gets stuck a little bit after university if you're trying to create a new business. I suppose if you go into a very big multinational company setting, it's relatively straightforward because there are routes and pathways, although not always without challenges. So it's not necessarily easier. But I think the difficulty you have when you leave university is well, we've equipped you, hopefully, with the skills for doing something you're very good at and which you want to do. So it's matching your aspirations and your talents. And then the next thing, which I think universities didn't used to think about, but which we're now much better at, is in how do we prepare you for that? How do we actually help you? So if I go back to my own university education, I don't think with great respect to my two very good universities, which I'm very fond of, they really thought a lot about what I was going to do when I left. They saw their job as finishing when I shook the hand and got the certificate at the end of it. I think we now recognise that's a very old-fashioned view. And most universities now, and certainly our university, looks at building in things about career preparation, setting up a business and being involved in a business as part of the degree experience. And we have, for example, as many places do now, incubation facilities for new businesses and small businesses. Because what I do agree with you is that the creative industries, a lot of people try and create small and medium-sized industries. It's what the creative industries are in the UK. Lots of SMEs. There's a few very big players, the BBC, for example. But in general, it's a small set of companies. Massively important, £100 billion of creative economy in the UK, but often very, very small. 1 and 2, 3, 10 people businesses, and they are challenging. And so I do think that you're right, that sometimes that transition is much more difficult if you're trying to set up a small company than if you go into an existing structure. But I'm not sure that they sort of struggle any more than anybody does trying to do that particular project. But our responsibility as universities must be to prepare them and to keep in touch with them, not just, so they can come back as alumni and talk about what they do, but to keep in touch with them so we know they're on the right track. It's much more of a long-term contract. It's not just the 18 to 22, it's the 18 to 28, by which time we'd hope they are established. And then we keep in touch with an alumni. But there's much more positive help needed between the degree departure and then going out. It's got a transition point.
Yeah, it's a big transition. And actually, you made a really good point there, a really good distinction, which I perhaps hadn't considered, which is the big businesses that you don't really actually see. It's not the folks themselves getting stuck. I think it's the challenges that come with a small business that I see. And what they're grappling with is actually that arrangement rather than anything that's individual.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd agree on that one, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think actually I hadn't really kind of thought it through to that point, and I appreciate that distinction because, again, when I see creative people going to work for larger organisations, it's a different game. What do you feel are some of the positive opportunities? You've touched upon them earlier in our conversation, I feel, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about those in terms of what some of the more near-term opportunities are for folks in the world today, and appreciate things are fast changing compared to, say, 20 years ago. So what are some of the opportunities that are available today that perhaps weren't, that people could be thinking about that they may not be aware of from your viewpoint?
It's an interesting question, that. I suppose one of the things that may be differing is this thing we touched on earlier, that people are starting to recognise the value of creativity in industries other than the obvious. So, for example, we've just done a project with a very large financial organisation in the city, who in a sense you might think is the least likely partner for a creative arts university to be working with, because they're very heavily sort of international and financial. And yet when we discussed between the two organisations, the problems they had were ones that they weren't sure how to do, and they wanted creative approaches to problem solving. And we've had a very interesting exchange, and both institutions have learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope that they've also had some benefit from it in terms of solving their problems. And possibly the point I'm trying to make is that it's obvious that if you're a graphic designer or you're a textile student, you want to end up, working in textiles or working in graphics. But there may be other opportunities within organisations where your creative thinking will be really valued, and you can perhaps take your skill set and work now in businesses that understand why a creative person is a valuable member of a team. And I don't know that that was as well understood as it certainly 20 years ago it wasn't. It's becoming the companies that are thinking ahead and thinking about their own future and what will future-proof their business model in a rapidly changing context. They're thinking, what we need are creative people. We need people who will be helping us think in different ways, because sometimes some of the things we're doing at a mechanical level will be done by digital computer solutions. They want the people. So I think that students can be encouraged that there are opportunities not just in their specialism, but across into other areas where creative people are being valued.
That's really great. That's a wonderful point to hear. I don't hear many people talking about that. And it sounds to me from what you're saying there that there's all sorts of possibilities and opportunities in organisations and industries that you wouldn't ordinarily at first glance consider that creativity could be highly valued.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
You, John, your professional experience and your day-to-day stuff. I asked around a little bit on social media and elsewhere for some questions, and some of these questions have been kind of derivatives of that. Some of the things that came up, which I thought were quite interesting, I'd love to ask you. I was perhaps unsurprised, but also surprised pleasantly at the same time about how many responsibilities you have. How do you manage all of those responsibilities? You touched upon teamwork earlier, but what other secrets have you got in that sense?
Well, I don't know. I think you flatter me a little bit, but I suppose as a Vice-Chancellor, one of the things I think I should be, and I think is appropriate, is to be a sort of figurehead for the university. And so I always see part of my job as being in national debates and in London and on other as relatively high-profile boards as I can be, because it's important that the university and our position in Norwich is acknowledged nationally as far as one can. And of course, for that, you have to have a good team back at the ranch, because day to day, you can't be there, nor should you be. I mean, actually, that would be really wrong to be interfering. But so you have to set up a team. And I think I'm very lucky with the team. I mean, obviously, they're very committed to the same project that I am, and we work together very well. So I think you can only do that if you have people to help you in the day-to-day life. So it's them as much as me. But it does mean that you can do things where you can act as an ambassador, not just for the university, but for the region and for the city, because I think it's important we as a city all come together, as well as just the university. We're part of a bigger project.
Yeah, one of the things that attracts me personally to this city is this sense of community in so many different ways. Residents of the city, as professionals who are collaborating on lots of different projects. It's really encouraging and inspiring to hear that it's reflected in your experience too.
Absolutely. I think we're lucky that the city's really got its medieval sort of footprint still. And that makes for a human scale. That means that we can all get around and share this city in a positive way. And yet also we have sort of both city and county councils who are looking to the future. So we're not entirely stuck in that medieval history, which I think is a temptation sometimes, particularly for a city with history, is to sort of look backwards to it and say, we're more than just a tourist attraction, I suppose, is what I'm saying, because we've got a very vibrant sense. And I think the one thing I'd like to really achieve with the university and with our colleagues in the wider sort of business and sort of political community is to set Norwich as somewhere where people think of as not just wonderful for its cathedrals, but wonderful for its contemporary digital industries, wonderful for its games. I mean, we have a top 10 games course in the world in this city, and we've got the potential to develop some really important and exciting industries for young people. For the people in the schools today, they don't have to leave. They can get something really special. And it's happened in Bristol, it's happened in Manchester, it happened in East London. It can happen here. And that's the next big project for the university. And that's, to go back to your question about challenges and problems, it's not a problem, but it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, right. And what do you think as locals and as creatives, what more could we be doing to help Norwich realise that dream in that sense?
I think that we shouldn't be too modest. Modesty is a very endearing feature, I think, in people and in communities. But actually, we're quite an important city, really, now in this emerging digital environment. And we are perhaps not saying that as much as I think we could do as a set of communities within the city. So I think we should all be slightly prouder of what we're doing and slightly saying, just turn our volume up just half a notch. Yeah. I'm not on the Spinal Tap 11 yet, but I'd like to move from 5 to about 8.
Yeah, that's great. Just going back to what we were talking about a moment in terms of professional day-to-day duties. When you have to make important decisions, what's your highest priority?
Thinking about it before I conclude it, I remember talking to a very distinguished sort of academic when I was relatively young, and I was a great admirer of his books. And he was working with us on something, and I was slightly in awe. And I said to him, "Have you written anything else?" He said, "Oh yes, I finished a book last year." And I said, "Oh, it's fantastic. When's it coming out?" He said, "Well, I'm sitting on it for another 6 months while I think about what I think about it." I thought that was fantastic. I thought, wow, yes. That's the way to take. That's the way to do something that's innovative and new. Is you think you get it right, and then you reflect on it. Now, I don't think you have to wait a year for a big decision. That would be a rather poor decision making. Yeah. But the idea of reflection that was enshrined in that approach to writing seems to me to be valuable to take across into decision making. because you think you get something right and you spend a lot of time talking to people about it. And then you effectively come to a conclusion. But then just go away and sort of, think it through and talk it through. And with yourself, you can just sort of internalize that debate. Is this the right thing? What will it do? Why am I hesitating? Am I hesitating? Why did that very respected colleague look rather doubtful? Should we have another conversation? And when you sort of sense that all that sort of cloud disappears and mostly people are saying, yes, it's okay, and you're feeling, yes, it's okay, you probably have come to the moment when you say, yeah, that's the decision to go with. And once you've made it, you don't change it because you've got it right.
Perfect. That's a great insight. Thank you for that. Knowing everything that you know now from all of your experience, if you could go back to a younger John, perhaps the one leaving University of Sussex, and give him your best advice today, what would that be other than what you've kindly just shared with us there about decision making, which I thought was brilliant?
Oh, I suppose the young John was a bit too arrogant. So be a bit less arrogant. Possibly that's the privilege of youth. I don't know. I suppose that better advice would be just to relax and yes, it's okay, and that everybody does have these anxieties when you leave university, and it isn't entirely clear, but to be confident that you will be able to achieve things. I had a very good education, and I hope my own students are getting a similarly good education, and that they are equipped, and to have the confidence to know that it's going to be okay, but that life is not a sort of straight line to success, and to not believe Instagram, that everybody's having a perfect meal or a perfect holiday or a perfect life. It's actually a series of little moves forward, and that I was well equipped for that, and I think the next generation are equally well equipped and will be just as wonderful, even much more wonderful, in fact.
What would you say your proudest achievement? I'm sure there are many, but what's one of your proudest achievements?
I was very honoured to get the OBE for services to higher education, because I think that did confirm to me that my colleagues at least felt that I'd had a career of some value to the project I'd committed to, and so I suppose that's an achievement that I'm very, very proud about. I think the university here in Norwich has been something I'm massively pleased to have done, because I thought it had such wonderful potential, and I was pleased I was right that community was ready to develop and grow. So the university here is I'm proudest of it, and will remain so, I think.
That's great, really great. And what's inspired you most recently?
It's always a book, I suppose. It's always something that, or a film, or something you see that makes you just rethink the world, and that's what the arts do. I'm going to struggle to find something now, but the answer is always a book or a song or something where you realise, oh yeah, that's what they were saying, and that's why I should rethink this. Or you go and you look at a painting. Yeah, so it's always something where someone's thought originally about something, or in a way I hadn't thought, and it just makes you more thoughtful yourself.
And what are you grateful for today?
I'm just grateful for sort of the fact that we're all able to have these sort of conversations, and that there's a society still where we can have debates about what's important and why the arts are important. I sometimes think the arts are not as well narrated in society as we need to, and at times of complexity, the arts will be important to us, and so I'm glad we're still talking about them.
Yeah, I'm glad we're having this conversation too, so I really appreciate that. And for our listener, John, where can they find out more about the university and your work? NUA is our name, and you'll find the website everywhere, and look it up and see what you think. And it's not right for everybody, but if you're creative and you're interested in the creative arts, we'd like to have a chat with you, and then we can make a mutual decision about it, because that's the way it is. And if it's right for you, we'd be delighted to see you. Great. Thank you so much for your time, John.
Rob, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. Nothing beats the stories and advice of an expert to help you raise your creative game. I would love to know what you thought about today's episode, so don't forget to subscribe in iTunes, where you can rate and review the show. If you like this episode, I invite you to share it on Facebook or Twitter with the one person you know who will benefit from the wisdom shared here today. You can find the show notes on inspirationalcreatives.com/podcast. If you have a burning question or a great idea for a guest, head on over to inspirationalcreatives.com/contact, where you can connect with me there.